Wildland fire is essentially classified as any fire that occurs outside of a structure. And so it could be anything from a simple grass fire, slow moving, haystack fires, which are dreadful and frequent, or a significant forest fire.
A wildland fire is often started by humans. I would say 80% of wildland fires are human caused. And that could be a cigarette butt, an unattended campfire, or even chains dragging along a trailer that may spark. Because when the relative humidity is right at that right point, any sort of spark, even as minute as a chain spark, could ignite a fire. So I would say human caused 80% and about 15% naturally caused. And so natural causes would be a lightning strike, probably the most common, and volcanoes, which don't happen very often, but they are listed as sort of a natural cause of wildland fire.
One of the first fires that I ever went to, a squirrel came too close to a transformer on a power line in a rural setting. The transformer blew, instantly cooked the squirrel, and the poor squirrel fell in some dry grass, and his dead body started the fire.
The environmental impacts of a wildland fire can be immense. We have very fragile species that sort of live in the western United States, and some of those are sort of on the fringe of survival. And so when they're sort of squeezed out of their habitat, that puts their species in peril. And so I especially think of sort of raptors and large birds that nest really high in trees and have very delicate sort of life cycles. Sometimes they'll only lay a couple of eggs a year, if that, and then the success rate from that point is very low. So when you throw an environmental impact like a wildland fire in the mix, we can see species of concern and even endangered species be further impacted or sort of forced out of their homes. So we often think of the places where we live, and could we lose our community or our house in a wildland fire? Well, the same is very true for many of the wildlife species, and even the plant communities are quite fragile.
But there are other impacts, environmental impacts. The runoff from fires that occur in the wildland, contaminating rivers and streams, is a problem. Fish kills can be a problem. One of the other big things with regards to environmental impacts from wildland fires is when the fire happens and leaves a scarred area where much of the vegetation is gone, much of the trees are burned up. Those areas are far more susceptible to landslides and floods.
So what a fire does for an ecosystem that is positive, that is good, is it in a way gives nature a fresh start. When you have different sort of plants growing together in harmony, sometimes invasive plants are introduced, and we start to see sort of the balance of nature shift. And so a fire gives us a unique opportunity for nature to restart as it should. So it certainly can have positive effects on sort of invasive species and overgrown areas especially. We want sort of these different ecosystems to thrive, and oftentimes when they're not thriving is when they're overgrown and an area hasn't burned in 100 to 150 years. So what does it look like in a burn scar area, or what is it like? It's like being on another planet in areas that have been burned, especially scorched down to the ground. But there's a lot of beauty out there. We're on a fire in southern Utah, and the entire surface that we were mopping up on, which was sort of a smoldering area, was black and charred. And I was able to see something sort of moving in some of the brush that we were working on, and it was actually a whiptail lizard. And it had somehow survived that front moving through. And so it was moving really slowly, and they're often you're often unable to pick those animals up because they're so quick. But it was probably in shock, so I was able to actually pick it up and relocate it to another area. So I think it can be devastating to find yourself in a scorched or burned area, but it can also be incredibly inspiring to find out just how resilient that life actually is. Yeah, it can be really beautiful. The ground and many of the leftover trees will still be black, but it will be splotched with sections of green, and the contrast just sort of takes your breath away to see plants kind of growing through a scorched area. So you'll see small plants, shrubs, and some grasses sort of move in first. You really won't see any trees or tall trees anyway, for a decade or two. So it's a very slow process for nature to sort of redevelop. But those signs of life can be seen within weeks, even months.
I wish the news crews would go back 6 months later and show that all these little trees budding up and the grass looks better than it ever did before. Because I think that would lend itself to us understanding the cycle, the circle of life. So we've all seen Bambi, right? So there's that element of it. There's displacement of animals and the wildlife and flora and fauna that live in a given geographic area. But I think what a lot of people probably don't understand is wildland fire is a natural cycle of life, right? It was absolutely remarkable the first time that I went back to a burn scar, even just a few months after the fire had happened, to see how much life was occurring, right? So there are environmental impacts for sure, but it is a natural cycle. It does lend itself to regrowth and revitalization of the soils and the plants in the given area.
I think what people are often surprised to hear, having worked on the fire line, is that fire is incredibly beautiful. Being there on the fire line is something like you'll sort of never experience. I've taken a bunch of pictures on fires, and I think areas that have been scorched or burned are actually really cool to look at. I think that it shows sort of a cleansing or a revitalization, a rejuvenation of a landscape. And to me, that sort of concept is really beautiful. And so working on a fire is not all doom and gloom. Fires are devastating to communities and to cultures. But in terms of nature and wilderness, it's really beautiful to see sort of a restart, a refresh.